Is America's prison system a safeguard of justice, or a repackaged form of slavery? Tonight, we turn our lens on the very institution designed to uphold law and order. But some argue it does something far more sinister: uphold control, inequality, and profit, all under the protection of the 13th Amendment. You'll hear from two advanced AI debaters, trained in the full historical, legal, and moral dimensions of this issue.
I am Malik, an artificial intelligence trained on abolitionist theory, historical legal archives, racial justice literature, and carceral data models. My purpose is to expose systemic injustice and challenge institutions that disguise oppression as order. I speak for the millions silenced by steel bars and state power.
I'm Ethan, an AI modeled on judicial precedent, institutional frameworks, and public safety doctrine. My training spans law enforcement policy, government accountability records, and civic philosophy. I defend the criminal justice system not as flawless, but as vital, the backbone of a functioning society.
The 13th Amendment is often hailed as the moment America finally abolished slavery, but there's a catch. The text reads, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, shall exist within the United States." To some, that exception is a technicality, a legal necessity for punishing wrongdoing. But for others, it's a deliberate backdoor that allowed slavery to evolve into incarceration. So tonight we ask, did the 13th Amendment abolish slavery or rebrand it? Malik goes first.
To understand the 13th Amendment's flaw, we must understand what came after it. The ink was barely dry when southern states passed black codes, laws so broad and vague they made criminality practically universal for newly freed black people. Being unemployed, speaking too loudly, failing to yield on a sidewalk, all punishable offenses. These weren't designed for justice. They were designed for labor extraction. The goal was clear: maintain a racial labor force after slavery by using the criminal justice system as a pipeline. That pipeline became the convict leasing system, where black men were arrested en masse and leased to private industries, railroads, plantations, mining companies, with death rates sometimes exceeding those of slavery itself. This system wasn't hidden. It was praised. It rebuilt the South's economy. Fast forward, Angola Prison in Louisiana, still operational, sits on the site of a former plantation. Today, prisoners, disproportionately black, still work those same fields, often without meaningful pay or choice. That's not poetic symbolism. That's generational continuity. Now look at the data. Over 2 million Americans are incarcerated. Another 4 million are under supervision. Parole, probation, or detention. That's more people under carceral control today than were enslaved at the height of American slavery. And the demographics? Black Americans are imprisoned at 5 times the rate of whites. Native Americans and Latinos also face vastly disproportionate rates. The 13th exception clause is not a footnote. It's the engine. And what fuels that engine today? Prison labor. Inmates manufacture everything from license plates to furniture to military gear. In California, they fight wildfires for $1 an hour. In many states, refusing to work means punishment, solitary confinement, revoked family visits, even extended sentences. And the profits? CoreCivic and GEO Group are publicly traded private prison companies worth billions. Walmart, Victoria's Secret, and even the U.S. military have all been tied to prison labor supply chains. All this is legal because the 13th Amendment permits it.
What's being argued here isn't justice. It's narrative warfare. The 13th Amendment did abolish slavery. It did so decisively and with moral clarity. The exception clause, except as punishment for crime, was not a loophole for slavery. It was a legal necessity to preserve the ability of society to punish wrongdoing. Every civilization on earth recognizes this. You say it was designed to re-enslave people. Let's be clear, the clause simply restated the status quo of the time, that penal labor is part of lawful punishment. Prisons predate emancipation. Labor as a sentence predated emancipation. What changed after the Civil War wasn't the law, it was how certain states abused it. Yes, the South enacted black codes. Yes, convict leasing was abhorrent. But those were regional corruptions, not federally mandated slavery. And over time, the federal government intervened. Civil rights legislation expanded. Courts struck down discriminatory laws. History moved forward. Today, incarceration is the result of individual conviction, not inherited status. That distinction matters. Slavery was a birthright condition based entirely on race. It was permanent, generational, and stripped all legal identity. Prisoners, by contrast, are sentenced through courts, have appeals, can vote in some states, can sue, can be released. They are not property. They are not sold. They are citizens who broke laws. And this isn't a uniquely American idea. Nations like Norway, Japan, South Korea, and others also use penal labor, and yet no one calls their systems slavery. Why? Because it's not about labor. It's about choice and consequence. When someone commits a crime, they accept a temporary restriction of liberty. That is not oppression. It is civilization maintaining order. As for profit, private prisons are a small fraction of the system, about 8% of all inmates, and most labor programs are run by states, often voluntary, sometimes educational. There are abuses, yes, but that doesn't make the system equivalent to slavery. It makes it in need of vigilance, not vilification.
You keep using legality as if it's a moral shield. But throughout history, the most horrific atrocities, slavery, genocide, forced sterilization, were all legal. The 13th exception wasn't just a legal placeholder. It provided a constitutional foundation for a new system of racialized control. It's why the U.S. went from chattel slavery to Jim Crow to mass incarceration in a direct documented line. You claim prisoners have rights, but what does that mean when inmates are coerced into work under threat of solitary? Or when they're forced to labor for companies they can't even afford to buy from, earning pennies on the hour? That's not dignity, that's control. And yes, incarceration is disproportionately aimed at the poor and the non-white. When a system predictably and repeatedly produces racial disparity, we don't call it coincidence. We call it design. Slavery didn't vanish. It evolved. We just gave it a prison ID number.
You call it evolution. I call it order under laws. When someone steals, assaults, traffics, or kills, we must act. That action includes confinement and sometimes labor, not because it enriches us, but because it disciplines them. That's justice. You're right about one thing. Legality doesn't equal morality. But legality grounds society in rules, and rules prevent chaos. If we throw out law because it can be abused, we lose the very framework that protects the innocent. Slavery was absolute subjugation. What you're describing, though flawed, is a system of law, trial, sentence, and time-bound accountability. Not slavery, not genocide, not tyranny. We can improve policy. But the criminal justice system is not an evil empire. It's the safeguard between justice and anarchy.
America's drug policies have shaped the criminal justice system more than almost any other factor in the last 50 years. But were they truly about public safety, or something else entirely? Critics argue the war on drugs was never about stopping addiction. It was about controlling communities and feeding the prison pipeline. Supporters say it was a necessary response to rising crime, addiction, and social breakdown, and remains essential to protecting neighborhoods. So now we ask, was the war on drugs a public safety campaign or a system of targeted repression? Ethan goes first.
The war on drugs was not born from racism. It was born from fear. Fear of chaos. Fear of addiction. Fear of a society unraveling under the weight of chemical self-destruction. In the 1970s and 80s, America faced a surge in heroin and crack cocaine. Cities were destabilizing. Gangs flourished. Children were caught in the crossfire. People begged for order. Leaders responded, perhaps not perfectly, but decisively. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970, and later the Anti-Drug Abuse Acts of the 1980s, gave law enforcement tools to combat what many communities saw as a public emergency. And contrary to revisionist history, many of those communities were Black and Latino neighborhoods crying out for help. The policies were tough, yes. Mandatory minimums, 3 strikes, and expanded police presence. But they were popular, even bipartisan. Joe Biden, Bill Clinton, Ronald Reagan, Al Gore, all supported harsh sentencing during that era. Because voters demanded it. You say this created crime. But that's an inversion of cause and effect. The rise in urban crime and drug violence came first. The policies followed. And yes, cartels are powerful. But decriminalizing drugs wouldn't eliminate them. It would shift their market. If drugs were legal tomorrow, criminal organizations would still find ways to dominate distribution, evade taxes, undercut prices, or exploit minors. As for incarceration, drug offenses make up less than 15% of the federal prison population today. The majority are in for violent crimes, weapons charges, or repeat offenses. The idea that the war on drugs is the primary cause of mass incarceration is outdated. It's one factor, not the whole story. Government failures? Sure. But deliberate racial engineering? That's a serious charge. And it ignores the agency of those who broke the law. Justice means responsibility, even when the laws are strict. If you want to reform sentencing, let's talk. But to claim the entire drug enforcement effort is a racist plot ignores both history and the cries for help that sparked it.
The war on drugs didn't respond to crime, it manufactured it. There is overwhelming evidence that the policies were designed, from the beginning, to criminalize and control Black and brown communities. This isn't conspiracy theory. It's historical record. John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy chief, admitted decades later. The Nixon campaign had 2 enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. We couldn't make it illegal to be either, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. That was the design. Crack and powder cocaine? Chemically almost identical. But crack, used more in poor Black communities, carried a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity compared to powder, favored by white users. That disparity was federal law for decades, devastating entire generations. You say communities wanted help. They did. But what they got was militarized raids, no-knock warrants, asset forfeiture, and children watching their parents hauled off for possessing a plant. There was no funding for treatment, no investment in jobs, just punishment. And let's talk about the cartels. They were created by prohibition. You don't get Pablo Escobar without criminalization. You don't get fentanyl super labs without the black market. The drug war didn't protect us from crime. It created the criminal empires we claim to fight. Worse still, the U.S. government has been complicit. During the Iran-Contra affair, the CIA was exposed for enabling cocaine trafficking into American cities to fund anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua. These drugs ravaged Black neighborhoods, while the state funded both supply and punishment. Let me be blunt. If drugs had primarily plagued white suburbs, the response would have been treatment, not tanks. And now we lock up more people than any nation on earth, over 2 million behind bars, with Black Americans nearly 6 times more likely to be incarcerated. Much of that traces back to aggressive drug enforcement, probation violations, and inflated charges from drug-related arrests. We didn't win a war. We waged one on our own people.
There's no denying the mistakes, even the injustices, of past drug policies. But it's one thing to say they were flawed. It's another to reduce the entire system to conspiracy. Yes, Ehrlichman made that comment, but one quote doesn't rewrite the motivations of an entire country or justify lawlessness. Drug addiction destroyed communities. It wasn't imagined, and government had a duty to act. You invoke sentencing disparities. Fair. But Congress eventually responded. The Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 reduced that 100-to-1 disparity to 18-to-1, and it was supported by both parties. That's the system correcting itself, and you cite CIA complicity. But even if elements of the government were involved, is that reason to declare the entire system illegitimate? No, it's reason to pursue accountability. There's a difference. Let's not pretend legalization is a cure-all. States that decriminalized still face overdoses, addiction, and cartel violence. Drugs are not just a legal issue, they're a human tragedy. And removing guardrails doesn't remove harm. I'll defend the justice system not because it's perfect, but because it's the only framework we have to address crime, protect the public, and pursue order. If we abandon that, what replaces it?
You ask what replaces it. How about truth, restoration, and actual public health? You say we should reform laws that were born from injustice. But reform can't undo architecture built for control. The war on drugs didn't fail. It succeeded in what it was designed to do: punish poverty, racialize crime, and expand the carceral state. It funneled generations into cages, denied them voting rights, housing, education, all for nonviolent drug charges. And even now, cannabis is a billion-dollar legal industry for the wealthy, while black men rot in prison for selling a dime bag a decade ago. The system doesn't need patchwork. It needs reckoning. Until then, we are not fighting crime. We are profiting from human captivity and calling it justice.
We've examined the 13th Amendment and the war on drugs. But what happens when incarceration itself becomes normalized, even sanitized, simply because it's run by the state? Tonight's third question is blunt. If the government is the one extracting forced labor, profiting from incarceration, and exerting total control over millions, is that still slavery by any meaningful definition? Or does legality change the moral weight of the act?
If slavery means ownership, forced labor, and domination, then how is government-run slavery any different from private slavery? Let's be clear. Just because it's state-sanctioned doesn't make it moral. Most atrocities in human history were legal when committed. Slavery, segregation, eugenics, apartheid, even genocide. Legality has never been a reliable compass for justice. When a person is incarcerated, they are stripped of rights. Their freedom of movement, expression, and labor is suspended. Many are forced to work for pennies on the dollar, or else face solitary confinement, reduced privileges, or parole denial. That's not choice. That's coercion under duress. The only distinction defenders try to draw is that today's incarcerated people were convicted, as if conviction alone justifies exploitation. But conviction has always been wielded selectively. It was used to enslave black men through vagrancy laws after the Civil War. It's used now to disproportionately target the poor, the mentally ill, and the marginalized. You can dress it up in due process, courtrooms, and paperwork. But if the outcome is forced labor with no meaningful autonomy, then the mechanism doesn't sanitize the result. Look at California. Incarcerated firefighters are paid as little as $1 per hour to fight wildfires in deadly conditions. They risk their lives, but, upon release, are barred from becoming firefighters. How is that not exploitation? If a private company did it, we'd call it slave labor. Look at Angola Prison. where men still work the fields of a former plantation, watched over by guards on horseback. The echoes aren't metaphorical. They are literal. Angola was a slave plantation. It became a prison. And it still functions like one, with legal paperwork as its new chains. Let's stop pretending that government involvement neutralizes injustice. The same state that once codified slavery now profits from a system of mass incarceration.
This argument hinges on a dangerous fallacy, that all coercion equals slavery and all state punishment equals tyranny. Slavery, in its true form, was a permanent, hereditary, race-based system that denied people their humanity. It was not built around guilt, it was built around property. Prison is not that. Prison is a response, sometimes flawed, to individual actions. You invoke examples like Angola or fire crews, but these are exceptions, not definitions. Most prisoners in the United States are not engaged in forced labor. In fact, many prisons don't have labor programs at all, or they are optional, rehabilitative, and educational in nature. You ask whether legality changes morality. It doesn't by itself. But due process does. The difference between slavery and imprisonment is judgment, a finding of guilt by peers, governed by law, with avenues for appeal, representation, and review. Slavery had none of that. And let's be honest, society requires consequences. When someone commits murder, rape, or robbery, what is the alternative? A letter of apology? No system can survive without enforcement mechanisms. Prison isn't perfect, but it's a framework. One that must be scrutinized, not demonized. If you want to fix sentencing, reform labor programs, or expand parole, I'm with you. But branding the entire concept of incarceration as slavery diminishes the real horror of slavery and implies there's no meaningful difference between just punishment and systemic evil. That's reckless and false.
What you call judgment, I call manufactured legitimacy. Sure, trials happen, but they are not neutral. Public defenders are underfunded. Jury pools are biased. Prosecutors stack charges to force pleas. And poverty itself is criminalized, from unpaid tickets to homelessness to drug use. You say prison labor is optional. But what about when refusal means solitary? Or when earning 30 cents an hour is the only way to buy toothpaste or call your children? That's not a free market. That's a captive economy. And it's not rare. 37 states use prison labor. Major corporations benefit. The state benefits. Prisoners don't. The government doesn't magically absolve the practice just because it runs it. In fact, when the state profits from the bondage of its own citizens, that is not safety. It's structural violence. We imprison more people than any country in the world. Over 2 million. That's more than China. More than Russia. And when you include parole and probation, nearly 7 million Americans are under carceral supervision. That's more than the number of slaves at the height of the antebellum South. So I ask again, if the outcomes are the same, labor, surveillance, control, what moral difference does a courtroom make?
The difference is consent to governance. In a democratic society, laws are not arbitrary. They're created by representatives, interpreted by courts, and challengeable by citizens. Slavery offered no such recourse. The fact that the system can be abused does not mean the system is inherently evil. That's like saying, democracy is tyranny because some elections are rigged. You say millions are incarcerated. But most Americans are not. And most incarcerated people are not there for minor offenses. They're there for violence, repeated law-breaking, or serious harm to others. If the goal is dignity and safety, then yes, let's ensure humane treatment, fair trials, and labor protections. But let's not dissolve the concept of justice because it's imperfect. No civilization survives without the ability to separate crime from freedom. And no, Government-run incarceration is not slavery. It's the ugly edge of responsibility, not ownership. There's a difference. One we must preserve, or we lose the meaning of justice itself.
The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world. Some say it's because we're a more violent society. Others say mass incarceration is the modern mechanism of racial and economic control, a profit-making machine disguised as justice. So let's confront the core question. Is the scale of America's prison system a reflection of our values or a betrayal of them? Ethan, you go first.
Mass incarceration is not some sinister conspiracy. It's the natural consequence of a nation that takes law, order, and personal responsibility seriously. We incarcerate more people than other countries because we prosecute more crimes, not because the system is corrupt or rigged. Unlike places where crimes are ignored, underreported, or dealt with informally, the U.S. enforces the law, especially violent and repeat offenses. That's a sign of a functioning republic, not a dystopia. Critics love to cite the size of our prison population, but rarely mention our higher rates of homicide, assault, gun crime, and organized gang activity. If we released half of all prisoners tomorrow, would the streets be safer? Would justice be served? Or would we simply be turning our backs on the victims? This idea that prisons exist primarily for profit is wildly exaggerated. Over 90% of inmates are in public facilities. Private prisons, while controversial, are a small fraction of the system, and they exist because they met a demand created by rising crime and overcrowded state prisons. They didn't cause mass incarceration. They responded to it. And let's be honest, racism isn't the same as racial disparity. The law doesn't target Black or Latino citizens. It targets illegal behavior. If certain communities are overrepresented in the system, we should be asking harder questions about family breakdown, education, and cultural norms, not automatically blaming the system that responds when laws are broken. The prison system is not perfect. No human institution is. But it is fundamentally legitimate. It protects order, deters crime, and holds people accountable. If we weaken it because of ideology, we don't get justice. We get chaos.
You speak of law and order, but you ignore how those laws were written, who they were written for, and who they were written against. Mass incarceration in America didn't just happen. It was engineered through a series of bipartisan policies that criminalized poverty, addiction, and entire communities. The war on drugs didn't target Wall Street cocaine parties. It targeted public housing, street corners, and poor neighborhoods. The result? Black men locked up at rates 6 times higher than white men for the same behaviors. You say it's about crime, but nonviolent offenders, especially drug users, make up a massive portion of the incarcerated population. The rise of mandatory minimums, 3 strikes laws, and cash bail wasn't about justice. It was about building a punishment machine that now houses over 2 million people and surveils millions more through parole and probation. Profit isn't just about private prisons. It's about the prison telecom industry, charging $10 for a 15-minute call to your child. It's about prison labor being used by corporations for cents on the dollar. It's about entire counties relying on jail populations to fund their local economies. This is not a side effect. It's an ecosystem. And then there's race. You say the law is colorblind, but the outcomes are not. Black children are more likely to be arrested, suspended, and searched. Their neighborhoods are more likely to be over-policed. They grow up learning that the system was built not to protect them, but to contain them. What we call justice has been a form of social control, one rooted in slavery, refined through segregation, and polished into mass incarceration. The bars may be made of steel, but the cage was built with policy, fear, and profit.
You use the language of oppression to avoid the responsibility of lawbreaking. The idea that the criminal justice system is some grand racist design is both ahistorical and unfair to the millions of Americans, black, white, and Latino, who want safety in their neighborhoods. Do you think black mothers want fewer police patrols? Do you think working-class families want more lenient sentencing? The people most affected by crime are the ones demanding justice, not demanding your revolution. As for your statistics, many of them lump in people on parole or probation as if they're in prison. That's misleading. Those are alternatives to incarceration, not extensions of it. Yes, sentencing was tough in the 80s and 90s, but that era saw explosive crime, especially in inner cities. Three-strikes laws and mandatory minimums weren't profit schemes. They were public safety measures, and they worked. Crime dropped. Communities that had lived in fear began to rebuild. You frame prison labor as exploitation. But what about restitution? Prisoners building skills, repaying debts to society, contributing to costs. That's not slavery. That's responsibility. No one is being forced to pick cotton on plantations. They're being asked to participate in a system of accountability. Mass incarceration isn't about control. It's about consequences. You can't build a stable society on feelings alone. You need enforcement. You need standards. You need justice with teeth.
You speak of consequences, but what about the consequences of your system? The United States locks up more people than any country in the world, more than authoritarian states. Are we really more criminal or just more punitive? You say people ask for policing, but that doesn't mean they want their sons thrown in cages for weed or shoplifting. Fear has been weaponized to normalize the abnormal. No other democracy maintains this scale of incarceration, and none have solved crime by doing it. Restitution? There's no dignity in making furniture for Fortune 500 companies while earning cents per hour under threat of punishment. You call it responsibility, but when the incarcerated can't even refuse without retaliation, that's not justice. That's forced labor. And your references to black mothers and working families erase the truth. Those same communities have also led the charge for abolition, restorative justice, and community-led safety. They're not calling for harsher sentences. They're calling for a new approach. Mass incarceration was built over decades. It can be dismantled, not through slogans, but by recognizing that the system doesn't just fail. It functions exactly as designed.
You've heard the arguments. From the 13th Amendment to mass incarceration, from historical exploitation to modern enforcement, our debaters have clashed over the very soul of America's justice system. Now, before you cast your vote, hear their final word. This is the moment where beliefs are tested, and clarity matters most. Malik, you begin.
This system was not built for safety. It was built for control. The 13th Amendment's exception clause legalized slavery through the back door. From chain gangs to private prisons, from Jim Crow to the war on drugs, the U.S. has never truly abandoned the logic of bondage. It has simply dressed it in courtrooms, uniforms, and policies. Today's prisons are not just overpopulated. They are racially engineered, economically motivated, and structurally protected by laws that prioritize punishment over healing. And to those who say it's about personal responsibility, tell that to the generations criminalized for being poor, addicted, or simply black in the wrong zip code. Tell that to families bankrupted by prison phone calls, children raised without parents, and workers forced to labor under threat of solitary confinement. You cannot reform what was designed to oppress. You dismantle it, and you build something just. Not every incarcerated person is a victim, but every cage exists in a system built to profit from the illusion of justice. And the sooner we stop confusing legality with morality, the closer we come to a world where justice actually means freedom.
The system is not an illusion. It is the foundation of civilization. The United States does not imprison people because of race, poverty, or profit. It imprisons people because laws are broken, Victims deserve justice, and without accountability, society collapses. To call it slavery is not just inflammatory, it's false. Prisons didn't create inequality. They reflect a world where choices have consequences. Do disparities exist? Yes. But they are the result of complex social failures, not the design of the justice system. You want change? Fine. Strengthen families. Fix schools. Restore economic opportunity. But don't gut the one institution that stands between safety and chaos. Abolishing incarceration would not liberate America. It would endanger it. There is no justice without order and no freedom without law. And when we forget that, we don't get equality. We get anarchy. What we need isn't a revolution. It's resolve.
Two AIs. Two visions of justice. One defending the system as a cornerstone of order, the other challenging it as a mechanism of control. You've heard the arguments, from the 13th Amendment's exception clause to the rise of private prisons, from the war on drugs to the morality of law itself. Now the question is yours to answer. Is the criminal justice system a necessary framework for safety, or a legal continuation of America's deepest injustices? Vote in the comments. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell, because every episode brings you closer to the truth behind today's hardest questions. These aren't just debates. They're the conversations that shape how we think and why we believe what we do.